Are we about to see a huge correction in the collectibles market? I'll be covering this and a range of other topics on the very first of this new YouTube channel's videos. Okay, I want to give some background, a little bit of uh, setup to where we are today. Some of you may know me from Instagram. I run a investment and buying and selling business on Instagram, Kanto Vault. And I've been involved with the collectible space for a significant period of time now. And I often share my market thoughts. I often share my kind of views on the market, independent cards, or just market direction in general. And essentially, I've got too much to say for short form content. And so I decided that YouTube was going to be the next pathway and something that was going to enable me to have a little bit more of a productive discussion, combining some of that kind of investment background with the collectible space to give you an insight into what the market looks like on a week to week basis, what my thought processes are, where kind of I want to be investing, and where I see the opportunity for you guys in terms of value and potentially grabbing yourself something that is going to be a very good long term or shorter term hold. And the first topic for discussion today really is the state of risk markets in general. And collectibles fits into this bracket. So we see that from a kind of a traditional market perspective, and especially a crypto market perspective, we've seen quite a lot of pressure on the downside to those markets. Now, when we take a look at the indexes, the US indexes specifically, there hasn't yet been a major correction there. We've kind of started that process. We've started kind of eking a little bit lower in the charts, but we haven't yet actually had that kind of full correction that may still be on the horizon. Crypto, slightly different beast altogether, because we have seen more aggressive selling on that side of things, more volatile market in general, but also very closely linked to the collectibles market. So Pokemon and crypto tend to perform well together. And when we see crypto perform poorly, we usually see an impact on the Pokemon side of things as well. So at the moment, we've got a market environment in which volatility is elevated on risk markets. We see other indications of things like luxury good markets, which are showing kind of a year-on-year decline. And we've now got risk markets, which are kind of in this little bit of a perilous spot where we could see some more significant corrections. And as it stands so far, the collectibles market has actually performed relatively strongly in the face of that. However, when the risk markets do, if they do, correct to the downside, then that means that there's going to be a huge amount more pressure on the collectibles market as a risk market in general, and obviously a place where now there is a tremendous amount of value that is stored in some of these cards. So we're not talking about kind of 50 to £100 cards anymore. We're talking about things that are 5 and 6 figures, potentially even 7 figures. And so this is something that aligns itself really strongly now with risk markets and has a major impact. Both sides will be impacted then obviously by any sell-off. So at the moment we're waiting to see what is going to be the outcome here. Are we going to get a bigger correction in these markets? We know that Pokemon has basically just been consistently going up, and especially over the course of the last 2 months, again, some of those larger cards are just consistently making higher highs. And we know that One Piece kind of from the end of November onwards has started its run up, and January being the kind of the explosive month of growth for it. And they're the markets that obviously would feel the impact of any correction in risk markets in general. So they're the markets that we may expect to then see that fluctuation or the correction in prices on that side, along with obviously standard equities and risk markets in general making their move lower. But at this point in time, I think that is still to be determined. We also don't know how collectibles will act independently. We've had markets like gold and silver, which have been very strong on the upside, and that physical asset ownership has been something that has been kind of driven up in terms of investor mindset. And I think certainly from kind of a younger generation as well, people looking more towards what can I own that I'm invested in, not just what can I purchase digitally that will give me some investment. So I think that the physical investment side of things has actually made, a huge step up. And as a result of that, we may see the collectibles market act independently. But again, we're going to need to kind of wait several weeks and months potentially until we know the true impact of that. what we do know today, and kind of feeding onto the bullish side and the more kind of positive side from my perspective about the collectibles market in general, is that we know that the growth of this market is absolutely huge. Obviously, things like social media have a big impact on that, reason I'm talking to you today. But there's a big change in the way that the collectibles market has been operating, and some of the largest investment firms in the US still picture this as an industry and an area that has 30% growth over the next 5 years. And their statistics and their predictions are usually relatively muted in terms of what we actually get. I would expect that growth to be significantly higher, especially if we continue on the current kind of snowball that we're on at the moment for collectibles. And that really is something that I'm very, very focused on. It's something that I wish to take advantage of when it comes to the investment side of things. And it's something that hopefully through the course of, the discussion, the videos, the chats that you may have with me, something that I can potentially help with on that side as well in terms of the wider or broader education. Hopefully you don't need to go off and try and find all of these stats and information that I'm providing you with. And you can just listen to me for 10 to 15 minutes and get your overview of that. And the areas really I'm kind of focused on for now, my main bullish areas are Pokemon and One Piece. And if I had to kind of split those, if my time horizons are over the next 3 years, my more bullish side to my portfolio is on One Piece versus Pokemon, because I believe that market has the most significant room for growth. I think that market has some of the biggest bullish catalysts over the next 3 to 5 years. And I think that market is also at a very interesting intersection in terms of CCGs in general and where we'll move to. And I'll touch a little bit on that in terms of, kind of my thought process around this. And I'll just load up some of the data that we've seen for One Piece over the course of the last 3 months or so. And you can see, obviously, starting off in November and December, we started to see these climbs, certainly in terms of average sales that we were experiencing through here. And really just before Christmas is when things really started to ramp up to the upside. So a very strong end to December, a very, very strong January. And we're now starting to see that into February, those average sales are dropping off, but nothing kind of, giving a great concern. We're talking about kind of a 15% decline in terms of daily sales at the moment. But One Piece in general, I can talk about it a little bit in terms of my bullish thought process on One Piece and where I sit on that. And my view on One Piece is that this is a CCG that has experienced explosive growth in terms of player numbers, which is very, very important. So it's actually a CCG that is very good to play. It's a CCG that has a lot of kind of traction in its player base, and its player base has grown around 60% this year. And so we're also seeing a big influx of new players, which is obviously driving demand at the same time. But what we want to see is we want to be able to see a healthy CCG if we're going to be able to invest in that space. And we certainly have that from a One Piece perspective. For me, I think that One Piece also fills a very interesting kind of hole in the market, in that it makes it a very easy investable option for people in their mid-20s. Because I feel as though for people in their mid-20s, I think the Pokemon side of things, and please take this as purely my own personal views and beliefs, but I believe that the kind of the 20s age bracket is a relatively awkward bracket to jump into Pokemon. So that early 20s age bracket really kind of hasn't had the same experience with Pokemon as people who are at the upper end of 20s and into their 30s that grew up with Pokemon and were around during original Red and Blue releases and the original TCG game. So, there are a number of reasons why that younger demographic may not struggle, but may choose not to want to venture into Pokemon when there's kind of a little bit of a dead zone around that age in terms of, games that were released, popularity of the cards, and kind of just missing something. And so when you're trying to dive into something fresh and you're around that age bracket, my personal view and theory is that One Piece is a far better and easier thing to jump into. It is a game created for adults. It is a CCG created for adults, and therefore you don't have to feel as though you're some grown child to start collecting. And that's in no way, some insult on people who are collecting Pokemon, because I am one of those people with a full wall decorated behind me as well with Pokemon stuff. So my view is just that this is a really great entry point into physical investment for people, and it's an adult card game. It's something that's experienced significant growth, and it's something as well in terms of anime culture that we're seeing more and more that has become something that's been cool. Back when I was in school, you would get bullied relentlessly if you were to tell people that you enjoyed anime. Whereas now, anime is part of culture. It's part of the things that people are ingesting. It is on, kind of every major streaming service, and it's something that is very much ingrained now in modern culture. So we're starting to see kind of a big shift in that side as well. And One Piece kind of feels as though it came around at the right time. It feels as though it really is a matter of right time, right place for One Piece in the current environment. And then when we look towards the future as well, we've got the 30th anniversary of One Piece that's coming up. We've got the release of the largest set and the most kind of hype set that we've seen in OP17. We've got the manga that is still ongoing but will come to an end at some point. So there are a number of bullish catalysts for why, again, the future looks very bright for this space, not just what we've seen in terms of the last 2 months, which may have put you onto One Piece, but I'm kind of here to say that my horizons are far longer and far broader than that in terms of what we're seeing. We'll spend, I don't know, the next 4 minutes or so, just because I don't want to make this video too long. I can talk for a long time on this space, but I don't want to push things too far. But the areas I want to kind of cover off are taking a look at where we are today in terms of some of this sales data and kind of where we are. And I covered it off at the start, obviously in a macro context for where I believe the market to be. But I want to cover off kind of independently where we are and where we can think about kind of our buys and sells at this point in time from a more of a cycle or a shorter time horizon perspective. And when we look at One Piece, like I said before, those sales have come off the highs. So we're around 15% down from the highs now on those sales. And I think this is probably starting to be opportunity zone, certainly from my perspective. Mangas for me are very, very important from a customer acquisition perspective and for getting people on board to One Piece. Mangas are absolutely one of the best cards that I can pick up as a business owner because it is a fixed set. Obviously with expansion through sets, but it is a fixed set of cards that makes it very easy as a dive-in point. They're very recognizable cards, and they tend to be the first cards that people ask me about when it comes to purchasing or getting involved in One Piece. And we're starting to see the highs come off the mangas now. So we're starting to see some cards like OPO1 Shanks, which is down around 40% off the high, whereas other cards, EBO2 Luffy, and OPO5 Luffy are still hanging on, kind of really well up at the highs and still maintaining that value. But other areas of the market are starting to dip down. Other mangas are starting to move lower, and we are starting to see that natural correction. And I think for me, that provides opportunity. That provides opportunity in terms of these 30% discounts, 40% on Shanks. That provides opportunity in a bull market when we're in this environment where we have big corrections and we're talking about 30-40%, that typically is good enough to start kind of reinvesting or repurchasing some of these cards. Now, card selection is going to be very, very important. You can't just go at this with kind of like a shotgun approach and just start picking up all sorts of things and expecting to perform well, because the market will now start to mature. The market will start to get smarter in terms of what do people actually like and what is actually a card that has demand versus a market that is moving because everything is just going higher. Okay, so the rising tide lifting all boats theory. But the market will get smarter. So if you're purchasing mangas that really will have already kind of seen their peak, we've now corrected, and you start buying those mangas without the right research on those mangas, you might be buying something that actually the market just doesn't enjoy that much. And this initial spike is just because the market was hot everywhere. So again, you really need to do kind of your own research into where you believe the value is or what your time horizons are for holding some of these markets. And let's quickly go on to Pokemon. I cut myself short there because I don't want to, I can, again, just keep going. So I'm going to just cut myself short and take a look at the Pokemon side. The Pokemon side has been a consistent grind higher. So a consistent grind higher all the way through kind of a lull that we experienced, which was probably right around November. I remember vending at LCS, and LCS being an incredibly busy show for me. And kind of after LCS, things started to cool off. We saw modern Pokemon start to correct most heavily. Things like the Van Gogh Pikachus were down, significantly off the highs, over 50% in terms of total correction that they experienced. And we've now seen again, since that kind of end of December point here, mid-December onwards, we started to see now that ramp up and that escalation in sales again. And all the way through January into February, we just continue that kind of stairway to heaven approach where we're just gliding nicely into highs for daily sales. The most interesting thing around this information that we're presented with now is really the sales volume, and it's the low of the daily volume came in yesterday, and that is also tied with the fact that we saw some of the biggest corrections in risk markets yesterday. So at the very start of this, we talked about that correlation between those two markets, and we talked about impact of potential risk market correction on physical and collectibles. And we see that yesterday was a very weak day in terms of average sales and kind of what we got through there. And so we just need to kind of keep an eye on that now, because if that really does set something in motion here, then obviously we've got something in a data point that we can go back and say, it was that point early on in February, and that's when the market started to get spooked, and that's when we saw this change in the collectibles market. Or that point is just an anomaly, and it was just a particularly low day. As we can see from this information down here as well, we can see that this sales data does fluctuate quite wildly through these zones, but this is notably a lower volume day in terms of sales. So we just need to see now whether or not that's going to be an anomaly as a data point down here, or whether or not it is going to be a little bit more, kind of stronger in terms of the way that we can acknowledge that for future. All right, I got to stop waffling. I've got plenty of videos to do, and 17 minutes as a first introduction one is more than enough. So I hope that's given some insight into kind of my background as a starting point, into my views into where the collectible space is heading, why I'm such a big believer in the One Piece side of things, and some of the data that goes along to support that. But also then some of the thought around risk markets and where we are in terms of a cycle perspective. And I really want to use this YouTube channel to be able to make you a better investor. I really want to make you a better kind of, a smarter investor in the collectible space, and somebody that can spot opportunity and do the research on this side of things, because this space is very challenging. The space isn't something you just walk into and you just make profit. And if you have done, that situation won't last. It is still in a very aggressive space with people with years and years of experience of operating here. So it is something that you need to do your research on. You need to think about your decisions. You need to understand your time horizons. You need to understand what kind of average returns should look like. And there are a number of things. And I will do my best to take you through as much of that over the course of however long we're recording videos for. And if you could drop me a follow on Instagram, and obviously like and subscribe here on YouTube, that would be greatly appreciated. Instagram is at Kanto Vault TCG. There's going to be a link down below in the description as well. And thank you very much for joining me and listening to me for nigh on 20 minutes for this first YouTube video. And I will be back again very, very soon. Thank you very much.